All right, Andy Johnson here, and I'm sure you're impressed with my graphics. Just a Word document. This is a short one on how to describe research studies that you read in a journal. And remember, collecting data is different from doing research. Research asks a question, uses data to answer that question. You can have quantitative data and you can have qualitative data gathered through observations or surveys or other methods. Research is different from collecting data or simply doing an interview. Research is not research unless and until it has been subject to blind peer review. That means a jury of your peers, 2 to sometimes 6, who don't know your name and you don't know their name. They send your research study and they decide this is going to be published or this is going to be rejected. And they look at things such as methodology and subjects and is it set in a sound theoretical perspective? Is this person interpreting the data correctly? These are the types of questions. So in describing a research study, and this description should also help you when you read a study because you know what to look for. You use 1 or 2 sentences to describe each of these elements. This should be described in such a way that people can easily understand the salient elements and the important elements. Of course, in every description, you put the author, date, and title of the journal right there. Put the citation up there so you can find it if you need. If you're writing an article, you can easily see it and you can put the citation right there. All right, so get that on top. The question or purpose of the study comes next. Sometimes a study may have 2 or 3 research questions, but this is the important part because it helps us put everything that follows in context. So be very clear, the purpose of this study, the research questions were, and you decide if you want to list the actual questions or if you want to give an overview. The subjects or participants in social research, educational research, we need to describe who was in its study. People. People are in educational research most often. So who? How did you select them? What were the ages? Any demographic information that's important related to age or ability, and only include the information that's important to the purpose of the study. If we're looking at reading comprehension, things such as, well, social economic status is always important. It always is. So I might give a general, but stuff related specifically to comprehension would be included here. All right, subjects or participants. In a quantitative research, we often use the word subjects. In qualitative, we use the term participants. But sometimes the quantitative people are stealing our term and use the word participants. Subjects are like mice in a lab. Participants are participating with you in a study. And qualitative research is just as significant as quantitative. It puts the quantitative information in some sort of context. Qualitative research is used to help you understand as well as to find causal relationships. Qualitative research usually involves observations or surveys or other such things and other types of data collection. All right, the treatment criteria or conditions. This is the independent variable. What did you do to one group? What type of instruction or approach or method was given to one group? What was the one thing, if you're comparing one to another, that's different in the one group? Or the criteria for selection. If it's a qualitative research, what were the conditions that you used? How did you select that classroom? Describe where you were collecting the data, because environment is incredibly important. So, 1 to 2 sentences, maybe 3, but keep this to a minimum. All right, you are describing enough so that if someone reads it, they can go back to the journal. If you are seeing this, you can go back to the journal. All right, just enough to understand the salient elements. If someone wants to get more, they can go back to their journal. This is different from your notes. This just gives you an understanding. The measures or instruments, all right? How were the data collected? What tests were used? What measures? How did you observe them? How did you record the data? And then the results or the findings. The results, you are just describing the data that were collected. Quantitative research, that's pretty gosh darn easy. You're just including the numbers. Qualitative data is a little bit more difficult to do and to read because you're describing patterns and overall categories of things. So this is a little bit more difficult and you're giving examples. These are the elements. Knowing these elements in describing a research study will also help you in reading a research study. Then your analysis, here's where you describe what the results or findings mean or how you might use them. Yes, based on this, this is where you are able to put some of your ideas there that you interpret the findings. And there's no such thing as a perfect study. Use the data here to describe limitations and use the data here to be a responsible consumer of educational research. Researcher credibility. Does this person have background in the area that they are researching? In the area of reading, for example, I'm an old literacy professor. We see a lot of research done by people outside of literacy. And they describe reading, of course, in terms of sounding out words. So you get a lot of sounding out word studies. Well, reading is creating meaning with print. You need to have some background in the field in order to ask the right questions and know what data to collect. For example, I know very little about finance. Doing any research in finance, I wouldn't know what to do. Or in a science area, I couldn't do that research. So there has to be some credibility. And does the researcher have an agenda? I was reading some research, and I won't mention the author, but it wasn't described, but the researcher was also the inventor of the reading method. So the researcher stood to gain from a positive finding. So lo and behold, the results of the research was that the researcher's program showed statistically significant improvements. Imagine that. The researcher forgot to include that. And the journal, it was a journal published by the International Dyslexia Association. That is a very biased organization. They only allow certain viewpoints there. They don't really have peer review. And only research that supports their Orton-Gillingham type programs is allowed to be published there. I would never, my articles in a million years would never be able to be published there. All right, off on a tangent. The literature review. Is the study set in a sound theoretical context? And again, you get a sense of that. You can get a sense of the researcher's credibility as well by reading that literature review. Having background knowledge, you go, well, no, wait a minute, they're leaving out significant information here. Research question or purpose. Is it clearly described? Is the research question valid? A valid question. And I said a lot of reading research is related to sounding out words, and that's limited. But if they input sounding out words, if they use that to make conclusions about comprehension, well, that's not an adequate research question. Integrity, does the researcher show that he or she is believable? And then the validity of the results. Is it a valid measure? And little blips on low-level skills measure in reading is not a valid measure of improvement in reading. These blips are short terms and they do not translate to authentic reading conditions. Quantitative research, are the samples or participants the same, the equal? Is there bias in selecting one group over another? I'm going to select a group for the experimental group that's going to do better. Unequal treatment or conditions. I see a lot of this in literacy, in reading studies. They'll have a highly skills-based program, and they'll have a trained researcher, and they'll spend 30 minutes a day individually with a kid. Another one, they'll have a cartoonish view of whole language with nothing extra. And lo and behold, the kid that got more treatment, better trained teacher, scored better than this cartoonish. It has to be the same. Size and scope of the subject sample. Were there enough people in the sample? Are you making conclusions based on a sample size of 16, 160, or 1,000? This is related to the mistaken assumption of homogeneity. Human beings are not standardized products. What works for one group doesn't work for another. So it's often hard to take a large sample size and then try to generalize to either ends of the spectrum or to one specific group. All right. If you have a reading study and you show statistically significant improvement, can that be generalized to diversity groups or to low ability or high ability? Is the population clearly described? Is there a difference that is statistically significant? Statistical significance means the difference between pre and post, or the two groups, is greater than could happen by chance. And is it a valid measure? And I use the Dibbles as a great example of an invalid measure, asking students to generate a list of words or to identify nonsense words, a list of nonsense words in 60 seconds. That's invalid because we never see words out of context. And that's an invalid measure of reading ability. All right, qualitative research, detachment. Is the researcher able to detach enough to provide an objective view of reality? Now, there is no such thing as a perfectly objective view of reality, and the qualitative researcher will describe his or her limitations. It's the same with a quantitative researcher. Even the quantitative researcher is subjective in the questions asked and the type of data collected and how that data are interpreted. So this idea that a quantitative researcher can step outside of reality and be an objective observer of reality, that's just a silly idea based on a lack of understanding of educational research. Rigor. Did they collect enough data? Is it collected such that it is complex enough to address the question? Data depth and breadth. Did you collect a wide variety of data? We usually want to have a minimum of 2 data sources, not simply one. Not just field notes, but field notes and something else, or field notes over time. Depth and breadth. Accuracy and completeness. Did you make a case for I'm describing it accurately, or the interviews accurately address this, and is it complete? Is it coherent? Does it make sense? Is it logical and persuasive, and is it useful? All right, just a short video, actually a little longer than I wanted to, on how to describe research studies. Record author, date, title, question or purpose, subjects, participants, treatments, conditions, criteria, measures, results.